If you've ever heard the story of the Pilgrims, then you have probably also heard of Plymouth Rock, the point where the Pilgrims first set foot in America. It is on display in Plymouth, Massachusetts, and has become a part of American folklore similar to Thanksgiving and George Washington cutting down a cherry tree. However, the more one looks into the history of Plymouth Rock, the less believable the popular story becomes. Weird circumstances, historical inaccuracies, and shaky evidence all make the story of Plymouth Rock seem less like history and more like mythology. So how did this rock become a national monument? And is there any truth to the stories that are told about it? Today we'll be going over Plymouth Rock, America's fake national monument. To get directly to the point, we know with absolute certainty that Plymouth Rock is not where the Pilgrims took their first steps in America. In reality, a month before the Pilgrims had even set foot in Plymouth, the Mayflower dropped its anchor in the tip of Cape Cod, in what is today Provincetown, Massachusetts. This is nowhere near Plymouth Rock, and single-handedly disproves the main claim of its story. Not only did the Pilgrims step foot in Cape Cod before Plymouth, but they had extensive search parties and expeditions of the area over the course of weeks. Assuming the Pilgrims ever even came into contact with Plymouth Rock, it wouldn't have even been their first time stepping foot in Plymouth Harbor, since they set up a camp on an island inside the harbor days before landing in Plymouth. With all of this being said, it would still be a landmark if we had proof that it was where the Pilgrims had first set foot in Plymouth before settling the colony. But even this is questionable at best. None of the first-hand accounts from the Mayflower ever mention landing on a specific rock in Plymouth. So where does this story even come from? Plymouth Rock first enters the historical record 121 years after the Mayflower landed in Plymouth. The story goes that in 1741, a wharf was going to be built over Plymouth Rock, which would leave it buried and lost forever. Upon hearing this, a 94-year-old man named Thomas Founds asked if he could see it one last time before it was destroyed. He said that his father, who had come to Plymouth 4 years after the Mayflower had landed, told Founds growing up that the original Pilgrims who had been on the Mayflower had pointed out that rock to him as the specific place where they had first landed in Plymouth. Founds was carried to the rock in a chair, where he wept over the loss of the rock he had heard so much about during his youth. Touched by the story and eager to preserve their history, the residents at Plymouth preserved the rock and it became a local monument. While this is a nice folktale and a great bit of local culture, it is hardly a solid basis for a historical claim. A man who was not on the Mayflower claimed that the Pilgrims told him about a rock despite not mentioning it in any of their writings, and the only reason that we know any of this is because nearly a century later, that man's son, at the age of 94, claimed that that had all happened. The fact is that Plymouth Rock is most likely just a tourist attraction with some oral folklore behind it. It's interesting to learn about, but should not be treated as actual history. Though the popular narrative surrounding Plymouth Rock is not actual history, the monument itself has its own interesting history as the people of Plymouth figured out what to do with this new monument of theirs. Anyone that has seen Plymouth Rock in person knows that it is hardly a large boulder, and it is probably smaller than you imagined. It was not always so small, but poor handling over time led to it being damaged on several occasions. 30 years after Founds' story, just before the American Revolution, the locals of Plymouth had mythologized the rock, and patriots wanted to move it to the town's meeting house. When they tried to move it, they broke the rock in half. They left the bottom half in the harbor and continued moving the rock. It remained in the meeting house until July 4th, 1834. In celebration of Independence Day, they moved the rock to a museum. As they carted the rock to its new destination, it fell off the cart and smashed into the ground. Seeing this, onlookers rushed to the rock and began taking pieces off of it with hammers in the hopes of getting their own piece of American history. A few decades later, attention returned to the part of the rock that was left in the harbor. In 1867, The Pilgrim Society built a Victorian-style canopy above the part of the rock that was left in the harbor. However, it had to be chiseled away to make it fit in the monument. In 1880, the two pieces of the rock were reunited at the original location it had been, and the two pieces were cemented back together. The year 1620 was carved into the rock to show the year in which the Pilgrims arrived in America, and to this day, the rock remains where it was, though much smaller than it had originally been. Plymouth Rock is a great tourist attraction, a nice piece of oral storytelling and fun folklore, but it is not historic. Not in the way it is usually taught, at least. The Pilgrims most likely did not land on this specific rock, but it is still a monument to something else. It is a monument to the rich culture of the area and Plymouth's long and storied history. Ultimately, if it brings more traffic to this historic town full of real monuments and attractions, then it is a good thing. However, if you are interested in learning what the Pilgrims' first experience stepping foot in America was really like, then watch my other video about this subject, where I go into the forgotten time when the Pilgrims had yet to find a place to settle. The real history is even more interesting than the folklore, and it's a shame that their story is not better known. Though Plymouth Rock is a good attraction, it is still interesting that one of America's most famous monuments is almost entirely fake.